All right, hello and welcome to Your Story, Your Impact, where we shine a light on the top players in the construction industry. And today we have a very special guest, Mr. Eric Fortenberry. He is the founder and CEO of JobTread Software, a fast-growing SaaS platform that's currently powering over 9 billion in construction projects around the world. And under his leadership, JobTread has become the fastest-growing tech company in North Texas, and he's earned accolades like Best Software Solution at the International Builder Show and Emerging Company CEO of the Year from Tech Titans. He's also been a finalist for Entrepreneur of the Year. And today we're going to unpack his journey, how he built momentum, and the leadership principles that helped him turn a simple internal tool into a multi-million dollar SaaS platform. And so, Eric, welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I guess for those who maybe don't know, why don't you kick us off with a little bit about maybe your origin story? Did you start off in construction, software? How did this kind of all get started for you?
Sure. I built and sold my first software company in 2015, and it was after that a buddy of mine was running a construction company. Had asked me to come over and help him, figure out how to
Mm,
scale his business. They were about 5 years
hmm
in, doing 5 million in revenue, around 10 employees, but just really struggling to scale the business. They had sort of hit this glass ceiling that, as they were trying to take on more projects, they were kind of sort of breaking down. And so
Yeah.
I went over there. I immediately saw the chaos that I've since learned is a very typical situation for construction companies. They had about
hmm
just I mean it's like literally just like papers everywhere, right? Like timesheets
Yeah.
walking in the door, getting put into folders. They're printing out every single
hmm
vendor bill. All that information
hmm
was getting put onto these folders and put on the wall, and then waiting for one of the project managers to come in whenever that was going to be, and they would get it out and they'd review it and sign it and put it back into the folder, and then someone else would come type it up into a spreadsheet, and then it got copied over to this other
hmm
spreadsheet, then eventually got
mm
entered into QuickBooks. And it was just very apparent that in order to reach that next level, they needed to get some better systems and processes put into place. And so
hmm
they asked me to help them figure out what they could implement. And so I went and I did a deep dive into all the construction management software out there. Really tried to see what was there. I had assumed I would just sort of help them find something, get it implemented. But as I really dug in deep, I started to realize that, like, all of the software I was finding felt like super antiquated. Looked like it had been
mm
started 10, 15, 20 years ago, or is going to
Yeah.
be, kind of really complex. It's going to need a full-time person to implement, or it's going to be super
hmm
expensive. And so I just, at the end of the day, like, I struggled to make a recommendation for these guys. And they're like, well, you're a software guy. Can't you just build us something? And I was like,
hmm
whoa, hold on. Like, I wasn't trying to take on a full-time job again. I thought I was just coming to
Right.
help them out a little bit. But as
Right.
I got to think about it more and more, like, I realized, like, this was an enormous industry that was lagging in technology. And I came back to the guys, and ultimately I said, look, I'm willing to do it under three conditions. One, I take over as CEO. I need the full ability to hire, to fire, to implement the right systems, processes, get all the buy-in, get everyone using it. Two,
hmm
everything I build is my intellectual property. So if this has the potential to become a next company, I can go do that. And three, I'll give you 1 year of my time. I'll show up every single day, undivided attention. We'll get this team and this company back on track. And
Right.
ultimately they made me CEO, partner in the business, took over, and I started at the very beginning. Started with estimating, started shadowing the guys, trying to understand, like, why in the world can we not hit our target profit margin? We were targeting
hmm
a 30% profit margin on every job, but, like, it was just like all over the map. Like, some of my original advice, like, you guys might as well go to Vegas and roll the dice. Like, it's a total crapshoot on how you're
Yeah.
going to perform on any given job. And so, we really started focusing on estimating. Really, I found too that a lot of the guys were using markup instead of margin to calculate their price. And so
hmm
they were, we were targeting 30% profit margin. They're marking the job up 30%. So we're just shooting ourselves right, right in the foot right out of the gate. The most we were going to make is a 23% profit margin on a job that, we marked up 30%. And so, had to get all that corrected. Also, I realized too that, like, we weren't like actually building budgets for our jobs. Like, we weren't
hmm
spending enough time documenting what was included and what wasn't included. There was no scope of work. Again, it was just a bunch of, handshake type deals, a bunch of back and forth buddy buddy things. Like, it was not a scalable system. And so,
Hmm.
I said, guys, put away your calculators, let go and focus on writing down and building out this budget, every single thing that's included from your labor, your materials, permits, equipment, everything that'll go into it. And then we'll automatically calculate the price. And so like that was such a huge transition for us. And ultimately, I'd say probably one of the biggest transitions is being able to accurately price our jobs. And it also let us have a
Hmm.
much smoother handoff so that once we won the job, we gave it to the project manager who actually then knew what we sold and what was included and not included. We could now use change orders. We started
Right.
really better managing that handoff and then, needed to sort of turn my attention to the operations, the scheduling, really doing the job costing, keeping track of all of our bills, expenses, all the subs, suppliers, everything, like having a systematic approach to keeping track of the financials of a project is so important. And so when we
Right.
kind of got all that buttoned up and then, ultimately turned to the back office and, again, it was just like the wild, wild west in our QuickBooks, like death by a thousand cuts. Like we had just
Yeah.
cost everywhere on the wrong jobs. We were being overbilled, double billed. We weren't collecting our AR, and so really needed to kind of shore all of that up. But long story short, we grew that business from 5 to 8 million in sales that year, and we increased their gross
Nice.
profit by 43%. So they had hundreds of thousands of extra dollars at the bottom line than what they would have had just by getting the right system in place, getting the right team, the right people, and at the end of that 1 year, it's like, all right, well, it's been great. Really excited for what I was able to do with that company. But I knew that this was my next company, and we started JobTread in 2019, and spent
Mm.
spent a couple years building. Ended up starting took it to market in 2021. Got it to like 200 companies that year. 2022 we got to 1,000 customers. 2023 we got to 2,200. Last year we entered around 4,500 customers. We just passed 6,500 customers this year, so our goal for the year was 7,500. Looks like we're going to blow past that, but it's really
Nice.
been fairly exponential growth, and so again,
Yeah.
I'm seeing the need, time and time again. It's just really important that these contractors have a good system in place to help them to manage everything from all their leads coming in all the way through to their closeout, making sure they're getting paid.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I noticed that myself where, a lot of contractors are really great, builders with their hands, whatever their trade is. Um, but yeah, just having the right systems in place can really just bring everything into order and, you know, bring down the chaos, as you say.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So was there maybe a certain niche of contractors that you targeted when you set out to build JobTread, or was it kind of more
You know,
broad?
we yeah, that's a great question, and we've really very intentionally from the very beginning have purposefully designed JobTread to work for any size job, any
Mm,
type of construction business, as long as you are, custom bidding every job. It's not like a recurring, service type work or service calls, things like that. Like, any
mm,
construction based business where you are custom bidding every job, that's where we've intentionally built this. I mean, you could have a one line item budget, to 1,000 line item budget, whether you're doing, new builds, GC work, your interior remodeling, exteriors, decks, pools, roofs. Like, we've really been very intentional about making sure that it was flexible enough and that it was easy enough for you to customize so that, regardless, what industry you're in, what type of work you're doing, you're able to
mm.
set JobTread up to work for you and to track your, pertinent information.
Right.
Now with that all being said, I mean, I would say like the largest kind of, subset of our customer base is definitely the remodelers. The interesting
Mm,
thing when you look at, remodel, I mean, it often involves, multiple trades. You've got a lot
mm,
more moving parts than if you're, let's say, a single trade, business, just doing, electrical or plumbing or roofing
right.
or, whatever it may be. Like, just like with a pool build, remodel often has to coordinate a lot of different trades. And so the scheduling becomes more
Mm,
complicated, getting the right materials, kind of managing these job costs for these much, larger projects. That's where just the need for job trade exponentially grows. And so, it's no surprise that, probably the majority of, our a large portion of our customer base is the remodelers.
for sure. Yeah, I'm noticing that myself where one of the one of the big jobs where you kind of had to pull in from every different trade, electrical, plumbing, all
Yeah.
that good stuff. Okay, so then other than maybe systems, what were maybe the top two or three kind of biggest problems you saw with contractors day to day that you really wanted to solve with JobTread?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's knowing your numbers. Like, if you don't
Hmm.
understand your financials and how a construction business, ultimately grows,
Hmm.
then really it's going to be very difficult for you to scale. And I
Yeah.
think even beyond just like understanding, every job and you got your price and you got your cost of goods sold and your gross profit, like beyond just that, it's understanding like your overhead and to go
Hmm.
from, are you pricing the job correctly so that you earn enough gross profit to cover your overhead so that you're putting enough money at the bottom line, your net profit, net income, and so like I really think that construction companies need to spend more time really understanding and really building out an entire budget for their company. Plan their
Hmm.
growth, set goals. If you have an annual revenue goal, then you need to break that up into monthly goals. Like every month, what is your goal? And what do you need to achieve that goal? And start making some assumptions to kind of, help you model this out. But like understanding, like, if you want to, get X in revenue, well, what's your average price point per job. Okay, so how many customers do you need per month? Okay, so
Hmm.
how many leads, if we know kind of, what our conversion rate is, then how many leads do we need to get and where are we going to get those leads? And so like, I think
Hmm.
there's kind of this really important aspect of understanding how the full cycle works because I see so many times, contractors are out there chasing that next big job and then when they get it, they turn and focus on that job and executing it and getting it all running and everything, but like they take their eye off the ball and they quit
Hmm.
filling the pipeline. And I think that's a huge mistake because when you're done with that job, you need to have things already in the hopper, ready to go, or already booked, waiting, to start on. And I see that kind of that struggle, and I think it goes from when you're growing from a solo owner operator, you're an entrepreneur, you're wearing every hat to figuring out how to scale and knowing
Hmm.
when to bring on a team, and build a team around you. That's where having that financial model can really help you to start making those hiring decisions and understanding, when can you afford to bring on a project manager or a salesperson or an assistant or a back office person. Like you need to really understand the mechanics of how your business is going to be built and financially,
Hmm.
make sure that you can afford it. Cash flow is the number one killer of construction
Yeah.
companies. And so
Hmm.
I think that is just like, I'm really big on like making sure that people understand, how to financially build and scale a successful and profitable business. And so, I think it's, so important that, even beyond JobTread to help you on every single job, it's kind of that, that bigger picture that people really need to also be able to focus on.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just had a conversation with two other people in the construction, and they were saying how similar to what you said, where, you always really want to be um, kind of advertising and marketing for new leads, even if you don't need them or even if you're full. And same thing with recruiting. Like you always be recruiting, even if you don't need anyone, you don't need
Yep.
any employees. It's just really good to always be doing that, whether you need it or not, for sure. All right, cool. So then I guess shifting a little bit to maybe project management and communication, I imagine you speak with a lot of remodelers about, managing projects. What would you say is maybe the biggest communication breakdown that tends to maybe throw things off, especially with maybe budgets or timelines?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, like a lot of times, and actually, I got to be the end user, the homeowner, the end customer of my own software. So I had a pool built at our house, and we
Mm,
used a JobTread contractor. And so, like, and
mm,
this is a little while ago, but like, I saw firsthand again what it was like to be that end customer, and they started off the project, really not sharing too much. And I was like, hey, can y'all share the schedule with us on the client portal because like
mm.
I knew there was this portal in this place where we could be more engaged with the project and where we
Yeah.
needed everything to go through and they're like yeah here tell you what and they shared it. I was like oh my gosh like this is so much better when I was able to
Hmm.
actually have some visibility into the schedule. Now, again, you don't have to share every single, task and to do. Like you can kind of share the high level milestones, but like when my wife and I are sitting there wondering why is nobody showing up today, you can just go
Hmm.
check, the portal and say, oh, looks like, we're actually, waiting for, the gunite to start, and that's not going to start till next week or whatever it is. Like, being able to have that visibility was so helpful. And, I'd also say that, when we first kicked off the project, we had all these kind of text messages going and communication threads and email and phone calls and like, like I think it got to one point where, my wife and the project manager had a text message, me and the project manager had a text message, me and my wife and the
Hmm.
project manager had a text message. We had
Hmm.
emails and like, it got to the point where like, I got sent a change order and I was like, wait, what the hell is this for? And, they're like, oh, no, no, your wife and I talked about it. I was like, all right, well, that's great. Like, I wish I would have been involved in that. And like, that's where I was just like, guys, like,
Yeah.
we need to just quit all of these little side conversations. Like, we need to leverage, JobTread in the customer portal to have everything and all the communication right there because that's what kept all of us on the same page. And I knew that the project manager could see it all. I knew that the business owner, could see it all. And so like, just having that one central location where we could keep all of us on the same page, like it was such a game
Hmm.
changer when we were able to switch and just put everything in there. Like, and I think that's like often what I see is like, you just have all these different avenues where communication just coming all over the place. And like, you need
Yeah.
one central place to document everything. And it's not, I
Hmm.
mean, it's a CYA for the contractor, it's a CYA for the homeowner. It just benefits everybody to have one place where all communication is so that if there's ever any miscommunication, any confusion about anything, you're not having to go look in a million different places and have all this finger pointing and say, no, no, well, we talked about it over here, over there. Like just that one place for all communication is so important. And I'd say one other thing that I think was like super helpful was when they started sharing the daily logs. Every single day, we started seeing the actual updates and the progress and the photos, and again, a lot of times there wasn't much for us to like, we didn't really need to chime in or comment on, like it was just them, the contractor kind of doing their work, but like, we truly felt part of the journey and we had so much more, appreciation for the intricacies of our build because we got to
Hmm.
see it as it was happening, and I
Right.
think, when you're trying to live through this, whether it's in your backyard, whether it's in your kitchen, whether it's in your bedroom, like, you want to see that progress being made because it often can be like super overwhelming, wondering when is this project going to be done? Like, you're on a
Hmm.
high when you sign that contract, and then they come
Right.
in and they just, the demo, and it just like, a world war erupts within your own home. And then like you kind of just hit this low and it's like, man, when is this going to be over? And you start to kind of climb
Right.
back up. But like, I feel like when you really can help the homeowner understand that roller coaster and understand that journey and see the progress getting made, ultimately that's what's going to create such a better customer experience so that that they understand where you're at, they know where they can get help and where resources are available and it's at a fingertip, to be able to kind of reach out and get, get questions answered or whatever. And so like I would encourage everyone, when you think about how do you take your contracting game to the next level, it's look for ways to improve your customer experience. I tell people all the time, like at the end of the job, even if you did the best possible work with the highest quality, everything, the end result is awesome. If the customer's experience along the way was anything less than that, then you still
Hmm.
lost. If they had a
Hmm.
terrible experience, if they had a
Yeah.
frustrating experience, if they feel like you weren't there for them and you didn't, be proactive and be transparent, like their experience is ultimately what they will remember. They're not going to
Right.
remember all the intricate details of the build. And so like it's so
Hmm.
important that you manage the customer's experience throughout that project. And that's how you're going to win those referrals, those 5-star reviews. It's so important that you focus on making sure that everything you're doing is to provide a great customer experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that you said that because actually similar to that, one of my mentors, he said he had a friend that did a house remodel for his house. He was out of state. He wasn't there. Hired a crew, and there was no communication. He was completely left in the dark, didn't know what was going on. He gets there, the job is perfect. It's the best he's ever seen. But ultimately, what was left in his mind was, I didn't know what you were doing. Like there was no communication. And so, yeah, absolutely. Like whenever we bring on new clients, always make sure to like over communicate, even just
Yeah.
like small things. Hey, we just built your first message. Hey, you just got ATP approved. Hey, we're sending it out, tomorrow at 5 p.m. Just any tiny little thing. And because yeah, when they don't hear anything, they kind of assume the worst, right?
Yeah.
And so when you can over communicate, it can really help you out for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. So then maybe shifting a bit to maybe budgeting and cost control. When you see remodelers create estimates, how close do they usually come to the final cost, and what maybe tends to throw those numbers off the most?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of times it's just they forgot something. It's
Mm,
not accurately budgeting a project can really, depending on how you've structured your contract, I mean that can just immediately put you underwater. And so my advice to people is like you build out a very elaborate template for each type of
mm,
job. So every time you're going to do a rip and replace kitchen, or you're going to gut a bathroom, or build an addition, whatever it is, like have a very elaborate, full-blown, very detailed template to start with.
mhm,
And then it's so much easier to remove things than to potentially forget to add them. And so
mhm,
if you're trying to start from scratch and build up this budget every single time, it can be so much easier for things to slip your mind, and then ultimately you forget to get in there, versus when you have a very detailed scope, a very detailed template from the beginning, you can just easily remove things. And I
mhm,
think the other thing that I see though too is like just too much, just kind of just ambiguity. Like you have to be very, very detailed. I see a lot of people who, they get into the project, and they struggle to hold the line with what was in scope versus what was out of scope. You have to,
mhm,
very explicitly say what is not in scope. If you know that certain pieces of this thing are like out of scope, and if they were discussed, then you need to document that, because at the end of the day, like the homeowner, again, it's a he said she said. Well, they might remember talking about this, but they didn't know that you didn't include that. And so that's where
right.
like you have to explicitly define that, because it's so hard for some people to just say yes, we would love to do that, but that's going to require a change order.
Mhm,
They just, so many people just want to say yes, and they keep doing more and more. And I mean, literally, it's just coming out of your profit every time you do that. And it's not that like you don't want to do it. It's yes, we would love to do it, but you have to account for that. You have to plan for
mhm,
that. You have to rearrange
right.
schedules. You have to go order additional materials. And so I don't see people using change orders enough to make sure that they're not coming out of pocket every little change that comes along. And to the
Mhm,
extent that like it's better to have a very detailed proposal up front. Make sure that you've taken all the measurements, you've gotten all the data, done the design work, everything. Like make sure that that homeowner has a very good visual understanding of what you're going to do, so that the goal is to not have to have change orders. You want to have spent the
mhm,
time up front working with them to really flush out the details of a project before you get into it, because there's nothing worse than getting in there and just feeling like this is just an open-ended, never-ending, project. Like that's why you
right.
got to nail it down from the very beginning and be very, very detailed in your budget.
For sure, yeah. So similar kind of to what you just said about the communication, like overshare, also kind of list everything out in your estimate. Because yeah, it's like you would rather hear, "Hey, this is too much" from a homeowner than, "Wait, you didn't talk about this."
Yeah. You know,
So
and
for
I think
sure.
too, it's like, sometimes people they want to just kind of rush and get in there and win the job, because they think that that's like, that's the only way to take that customer off the market, right? Like they
Hmm.
want to be selected so that they can, again, move forward. But there's a lot of different strategies for how you can do that. I mean, if you can just get them to agree, to some sort of a design agreement, or some sort of an upfront, consultation, or, whatever it may be. Like, again, like
Hmm.
you don't have to sell the entire project right up front. Like you can just kind of figure out how do you get them to commit at whatever amount. I mean, even if it's just a couple $100 or something, like that act of them committing to take that next step with you, that is also taking them off the market. So, again, I
Hmm.
encourage people to take the time that they need to really make sure that this project is going to go as you expect and as the homeowner expects. Make sure that you've got all the details ironed out and don't start until then. Like get that fully flushed out vision and design for the project. That's going to help you have a much smoother process going into it. Again, I'm also a big proponent. I mean, again, you give the homeowner selections. Let them make
Hmm.
their own selections, control their own budget. I mean, you could give them an allowance and then come back and kind of do the subsequent selections after, or kind of go through
Hmm.
that process up front. But like the key is like make sure that they feel confident in their decisions so that you don't get
Hmm.
halfway in and then they want to just completely change something and you've already ordered the material and like again now we're just frivolously spending money to make changes. Like take that time up front to really flush it out, and I think that's going to help you to end that project on budget.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think some subcontractors like they kind of want to leave maybe a small thing out because they think it's gonna like lose them the job. But better to include that and like you say, overshare with your details and
Yeah,
feel everyone is on the same page for sure.
yeah.
All right, then yeah, I guess shifting a little bit to maybe labor and resource challenges. When you speak to, contractors about maybe labor shortages, how is it hitting them specifically, and maybe what strategies are working best to kind of stay productive?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, like I'm a big proponent of, leveraging subcontractors where you can. I see a
Hmm.
lot of people who, they if they're crushing on sales, that's awesome, but like now you're scheduling, 6, 9, months out. And so like to the extent that
Hmm.
like, you can leverage subcontractors to bring them on to essentially, leverage them to help kind of subsidize where if you do have internal, employees and field workers, like if they can't get to it all, then bring in those subcontractors. And again, at the end of the day, like they may be great people that eventually you might want to lock in and convert to a full-time employee, great. Or maybe you never need to.
Yeah.
That's also great.
Mm.
But I think it's so important that you're constantly trying to build a bench of very, very talented subcontractors that are at your disposal. Just because,
Mhm.
you got your one guy who's just awesome, you've been using him forever, he does great work. Like you can't rely on that. Like, again, that guy could get, God forbid, get hit by a bus or just, retire or whatever it may be. Like you
Yeah.
need to be able to build this bench of really strong subcontractors. So, again, head on a swivel, always be looking for great people that you can bring into, your community and into your company. And that's going to help you to be able to scale. When you're in a pinch, you got people that you can reach out to. When you got more jobs that you could start earlier, you got that team of people, and it's just so much easier to be able to try these guys, as a subcontractor for a while before having to hire. Some people just think that like they've got to hire every single person as a full-time
Hmm.
employee, and what they don't realize is like that actually, it can cost you a whole lot more, having to bring someone on as an employee only to find out that they don't do great work or they weren't a good fit. Like, that's
Yeah.
where I'm a big proponent of like use the subcontractors for a while. You can bring them
Hmm.
on if you want to, or again, just always use subs. Like it can work, to your advantage to do that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially for, remodels, I imagine they kind of have to use a bunch of different
Yeah.
subcontractors. So for
And
sure,
I think
leveraging that.
I think too, it's about, again, pay them fair, pay them right, pay them well. If you really want people, to be your go-to, like you got to compensate them for their work. Make sure that
Hmm.
they know that you are the guy that they want to work for. And if they had to choose between your job and someone else's job, they're choosing yours every time. Make it easy for them to work for you. Again, the biggest problem that when I was running the GC, the biggest problem I heard from our guys is like they show up at the job site and they don't know what to do. They're literally sitting there waiting for the project manager to send them the plans or the specs or give them, more
Hmm.
instructions. Like that's where, just like with the homeowners, they can use the customer portal. You have this vendor portal, where you can give your subs access to the job. Share the designs, share the plans, share the
Right.
specifications, make sure that they have all the information they need before they show up at the job. Like that is going to
Right.
help them have a much better experience working with you. Make sure when they need help, they can get it as quickly as possible. I think that ultimately will provide a much better experience. And again, nobody wants to work for, work for a company where it's just like, you're pulling tooth and nail to get information out of them. And it's like, it just makes you feel bad. It makes you feel unproductive. Like you want to make sure that they're armed with the tools and the resources that they need to be successful so that they can get on to the next job. And ultimately, when you do that, that's going to create a much better culture and a much better environment where your guys are going to want to keep working for you and not for someone else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I actually just had another conversation where he was saying how if you have like contractors maybe complain that there's no good workers out there, no one wants to work anymore. As hard as it might be, maybe just, take a look in the mirror and say, what I want to
Yeah.
work for me. So
Yeah.
when you can ask yourself that question, it really do good for you for sure. All right, cool. So then I guess maybe shifting a bit to maybe material sourcing, supply chain. When it comes to sourcing materials, maybe any kind of supply chain headaches that our modelers are still dealing with, and maybe how does that impact the client experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, I mean, we all know in today's, climate, like, I mean, yeah, we got material prices, the cost is just fluctuating, right? And so
Hmm.
I think first and foremost, when you bid out any project, you need to make sure that you're getting a real-time quote for those materials. You need to know what is the cost today. I see so many people who, they think that they've been buying just, from the same supplier for the last 20 years and no, he's always giving me the best price, things like that. Like that is not the case. Like you need to make
Hmm.
sure that you're constantly evaluating your cost and what you're paying, even if you've been with that supplier for a long time. It's so important, that you do your due diligence and you're constantly getting those real-time price quotes just to check to make sure that you're still pricing your material accurately. I think too, in your contract, it's super, super important that you have some sort of a price escalation clause. Because if you send out a
Hmm.
proposal today and you don't have an expiration date on it, or for whatever reason they don't sign for 3, 6, however many months later, if the cost of the material has gone up, you need to be able to, have a change. You have to be able to reprice those materials, and so it's important that you've put some sort of a clause to protect yourself. I'm not an attorney. I can't give you legal advice. So please
Right,
do talk to, a local attorney in your area or somebody who specializes in your place. But
for
like,
sure.
just please do go look at how you might be able to add some legal protections for yourself in that event. But this is why like we've been really focused on building integrations with, Home Depot, with SRS distribution, Beacon, QXO, we're talking with build.com. Like, it's so important that like, we see a need to be able to have this direct integration with these suppliers, distributors, so that we can give you real-time pricing directly in JobTread. It's just something that, again, a lot of people don't think or realize that might be changing more than you actually realize. But, again, if the price of your material goes up 10% and you don't account for that, I mean, it's coming out of your bottom line. So you got to make sure that you're
Hmm.
always updating and checking your prices before you go sell that job.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you never know, like, the economy can shift, here and there, what have you, and staying on top of the price, factoring that into your budget, absolutely can
Yep.
help. All right, cool. Then I guess for maybe some, technology, when you see remodelers trying to bring in maybe new software or tech, what do you say maybe holds them back the most, and what features really kind of win them over?
I mean, the things that win them over. I mean, it's just being able to see how quickly you can take, a template, budget. If you're using like an app like Render where it does like interior, kind of the as-built scan using LiDAR. We've got some really slick integrations where you can scan the inside, or you could use like hover to scan the outside. And like just having all the
Mhm.
measurement data just come directly into JobTread and automatically do your material takeoff, calculate how much labor you need. Like, I mean, that's kind of that jaw-dropping moment where, within a
Mhm.
matter of minutes instead of like hours or days, they can turn around a very professional, very well-designed, very good-looking proposal that's interactive, and it allows the client to make their selections, control their own budget, got the built-in homeowner financing. Again, like this really is kind of taking it to the next level, bringing those contractors into the modern, 21st century here. And so I think, those are kind of those moments where they're just like, oh wow, like it's how can I not have that, right?
Right.
The things that that I think hold them back or maybe kind of make them fearful is really just thinking about what is it going to take to make a transition? How much time is it going to require me? There's a lot of kind of this fear of the unknown. I mean, if they've never used a software and you're trying to switch from just pen and paper Excel, like that can be a little bit of a kind of there's that resistance to change, if you will. And so I think for those people, that's where, I encourage you, regardless what software you buy, like make sure that that company has really great, onboarding, training, implementation support to help
Hmm.
you, navigate this new, online environment for managing your jobs. But at the end of the day, like I can promise you, I mean, we've implemented thousands and thousands of contractors on this. Like, it is not like too much that you can't overcome. You will be able to get comfortable with it. It takes a little bit of time to kind of, again, you're going to have to dedicate some time to learning the software
Yeah,
and how to do it. And I think the people who
for
block
sure.
off, even if you block off like 1 hour a day, like you can pretty quickly get up to speed to the point where you're able to leverage, this new software. Now, the people who have already been using a software, maybe they're on, some other system that, again, they keep jacking up the price on them, or they're just not seeing the updates that they want to see, or whatever, some experience that has led them to want to make a transition. Well, I often see those people thinking like, oh man, how am I going to get all my data migrated? I've got 5, 10 years of data in this other system. Like, can you import that data? Like, how are we going to get that over? Like, I think that's kind of the sort of the hesitation that sometimes those people will face. And again, I would encourage you to find a company who is prepared to help you migrate that data, whether it's through their own people or through third party applications or through third party services. Like, there are people that can help you with this data migration to the point where like you don't have to like let that be a reason or a barrier to you being able to get to a new system that can better meet your needs, that is more affordable. And so I think just any one of those challenges that might be there, like I encourage you to talk to the company that you're thinking about transitioning to, and just asking them like, how will they help you with that scenario? Because
Hmm.
it's these aren't reasons not to make a change. Like, you've got to keep up with technology, and again, like, you got to make sure that you are leveraging the best technology that you can, that's going to give you that edge, that's going to help you be more competitive and win more jobs at better
Hmm.
pricing there. I mean, that's the name of the game here, is being able to beat everyone out, and like, you got to have the best technology to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And kind of like I said earlier, like most contractors are really great, with their hands, really great tradesmen or builders. And when you can kind of partner with technology and link that up, you can really scale fast, especially now with, the rise of AI, right? It's only going to get, bigger. It's here to
Yep.
stay. So you can either fight it or learn to leverage it and kind of
Yep.
really, really grow for sure. Okay, cool. So then, I guess maybe when you hear remodelers talk about client challenges, other than, the communication thing you talked about, um, what are maybe the top complaints they get from homeowners, or what's the best way they found to kind of get ahead of those?
I think probably the top complaints from homeowners. I mean, it's I mean, and I've experienced this. I mean, you get a contractor out to your house and they say they're going to do something, they never follow up. They
Mm-hmm.
they don't honor their word. They don't send you that proposal when they said they were.
Hmm.
Like, I think that's like just ultimately one of the most frustrating things. And at the end of the day, like, you got to follow through. You got to honor your word. I mean, if you said you were going to do something, for better or for worse, when you get into that, like, you're gonna need to make it right. And I encourage you to
Hmm.
find ways to do that, and to make sure that you're always guarding your reputation. In today's
Hmm.
age, any future customer is likely going to go Google you, is going to go read your reviews. Like, they're going to want to understand, like, what have others said about that. And
Right.
at the end of the day, like I said it earlier, I mean, it's not about how you get it done. It's about how you make the client feel, And so
Hmm.
I think, if there's an issue on the job site, the more proactive you can be, the more transparent you can be. Don't sit back and wait for the client to bring it to you. Reach out and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Homeowner, like, we saw this issue came up. Here's three potential solutions. We think we ought to go with this option because it's going to, ultimately give us the best result. We're committed to getting this done right. Like, again, be proactive, be transparent. Like the one known with construction is that, unforeseen circumstances are going to come up. There will be
Yeah,
issues. And I think it's
right.
important that you explain that on the front end and help set that expectation that, look, that's why you're hiring us. When something comes up, when the project, has some sort of a challenge, like, we're here and we will be here to
Mhm.
make sure that we navigate that challenge together and we can have a successful outcome regardless what gets thrown our way. And so I think it's so important that, that you set that up, that expectation up front, and then you follow through with it, be proactive, be transparent, and just be there. Like, empathize with the customer and put yourself in their shoes to make sure that, like, you can really understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling and then address it from that standpoint.
Absolutely, yeah. And I like that you said that again because I think a lot of contractors kind of think, well, I did the job right. But yeah, like you said again, what they remember is the feeling, like how
Yep.
you made them feel. So when you prioritize that, it can definitely do wonders for you for sure.
Yep.
All right, cool. Then I guess shifting a little bit to maybe marketing or growth. When you talk to remodelers who are really growing fast, what kind of maybe marketing strategies or messaging seem to be getting them like the best leads? And on the other side of the coin, maybe what have you found to be maybe not so effective?
Yeah, I mean, I look, the people who are growing the fastest. I mean, they've got great looking websites. Their
Mm,
website that they realize is the face of their company. They have
mm,
set themselves up with a great website that is designed to educate and convert prospects into customers. They have
mm,
very professional looking photos. They're leveraging videos. They're creating a lot of social content that is, again, all ties back to driving people to the website where they can learn not just about, the projects, but like the process. What is it like to go through a construction project? What is your
mm,
process? How is this going to all go down? Like, some of these people might be first time remodelers. They don't understand what's going to happen when they sign a contract and how you're going to come
yeah.
in and just, decimate the entire kitchen and take out everything and dust is like, help them understand and educate them before they even call you. Give them the
Mm,
resources, give them the knowledge of what it's like. Give them pricing expectations. Whether you come out with kind of like, here's some ranges of prices, like, just set that expectation up front so that when you get on that call and you have that, that budget discussion, it's not a shock and awe moment because they already saw on your website that they should expect this project to be, between this range. So many people, they don't do that. They're hiding information on their website, because
hmm
they're worried about the competition, or they're worried that,
Yeah.
the customer won't reach out to them, or whatever it is. And that's the wrong way to think about it. You need to think about how can you educate them and how can you give them that knowledge and build the trust before they even reach out to you. Because then you have
Right.
warmed that lead up so much that it is such an easier conversation for you and for them. And so, I see the people that are growing the fastest. I mean, those are the types of things that they've done. They've really adopted this, this mindset, as Marcus Sheridan shares it best in his book. His first, it was They Ask You Answer was the first version, and now
Mm,
he's actually, I think it's like a third edition of it, is Endless Customers. But he talks about, how that has been able to, just how he encourages people to answer all of those questions that they get asked all the time. Like, just put it out
hmm
there and
hmm
create a lot of YouTube content, a lot of video content. Like, that will help you. Those are the people that are growing. I mean, I can't tell you though the number of contractors even that are signing up for JobTread, like, they don't even have a website. They don't
mm,
have a marketing strategy. They're
mm,
not tracking what is working. Where are their leads coming from? Like, if you don't know where your leads are coming from, then how do you know it's effective? And how do you know what's working and what's not? You got to
right.
have that, like, system in place to understand your customer acquisition cost. Like, what does it cost to get every customer? And when you can do that, you
hmm
can start to understand that, like, look, even if you're selling a $100,000 project and you spent, 5 grand to get that customer and you made, $40,000 profit, like, yeah, you should spend 5 grand all day, every day to keep bringing
Hmm.
in, $40,000 of profit. But until
Right.
you start tracking that, then it's very hard for people to kind of understand like that they should invest in a marketing agency, that they should find a marketing partner who can set them up for success. Like you should be spending, anywhere from, 3 to 7% of your revenue on marketing. But that can be a
Hmm.
very hard pill for people to swallow if they don't have the system set up so that they can actually track what is working and what is not working. When you can do that, then you can really surgically refine your ad strategy, your content strategy, continue to organically rank. But like, at the end of the day,
Hmm.
marketing is everything. I mean, that's the lifeblood of any given company. You
Yeah.
can get one or two customers here and there, but like if you want to build a scalable engine that runs, like it's something like if you don't have just, endless, warm referrals coming in, then like you got to get them somewhere, and that's where you tap into marketing, into advertising, and there's so many ways that you can leverage. I mean, even social content like that will help bring you more and more leads, but you got to be able to
Right.
convert them, and you got to know what's working and what's not.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I see a lot of contractors kind of relying on maybe too much on referrals. I heard this great analogy where it's kind of like the business equivalent of like a free lunch, right? It's nice to have, but how many free lunches have you actually gotten in your life?
Yeah.
So just making sure you're always like marketing all the time, whether you need it or not, and really having that influx of new leads.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So I guess maybe a couple last questions for you. If you could go back and maybe give yourself one piece of advice the day you launched JobTread, what might that be?
One piece of advice when I launched JobTread. I mean, I would say, I, probably the thing that I would have done immediately right out of the gate. It actually, I heard Marcus Sheridan speak at a conference, and he talked about, if you're ever doing something that, is basically, making it harder for the market and for your prospects to learn about you, such as like, hiding information from a competitor, like you're doing your prospects in the market a disservice. Like every
Mm,
time we rolled out new features, we would do these like customer town halls where like we invited all of our customers, but like you had to be a JobTread user to be able to attend. And so like instead of opening it up to everyone, it was kind of just like this small group of customers early on, and so they were finding out about what we were doing, but like the rest of the market didn't see how fast we were building, and so like I
hmm.
think that sort of caused us to grow slower earlier on. Versus now, I mean, like every time we do a product update, like it's open to anybody. Like you don't even have to be a customer to attend. And like we have 5, 6, 700 people show up to our product update, webinars because we can allow anyone to join in. And so like I think just like answering the information and putting it out there is so important, and that's the biggest transition we've made, just making our entire help desk, public, making sure that like everyone can view and learn everything that they possibly can about JobTread. Like we now have like over
Hmm.
500 something videos published on our YouTube. Like you can literally
Mm,
see it all and learn about it all, without even talking to us now. And we
yeah.
get 500, 600 new customers every month, and probably only like 50 to 60% of them are even talking to us. They just sign up
Hmm.
now without even talking to us. And like I think that's
Wow.
the one thing that I would have done, right away is just open everything up, publish it all, and just make sure it's easy as possible for people to learn about you.
For sure. Yeah. I heard about one of my mentors talks about pre-selling, like making sure you kind of answer all their questions that they might have before they even
Yep.
speak with you. I can really convert your leads for sure.
Yep.
All right, cool. And then the last question I like to ask people is theoretically, if you could have a magic wand and wave it and fix one thing about the construction industry, what might that be?
Man, I would say the one thing I would wave my wand and is there is a group of customers out there, or contractors out there that it's not a huge group, but there is a subset of customers that I feel like are kind of dragging the construction industry's reputation down. They're the ones
Hmm.
that are just cutting the corners. They're lowballing the price on every project. Like they don't
Hmm.
know their numbers. They're not organized. They don't often realize that selling these jobs way underpriced is not only,
hmm
hurting them, it's hurting their team. It's ultimately hurting the customer too, because they think that they just got to get anything in the door to be able to grow the business. And the reality is, if they just accurately price their jobs, even if they
hmm
won fewer jobs, they would be making a profit on those jobs instead of just breaking even, instead of just losing money, because ultimately, like, that's the biggest fear from the homeowners, is that, is this another contractor who's just a fly by night, going to take my money and run and not show up the next
hmm
day? And if I could just help all of those people who are just struggling, making those mistakes, because again, it's not helping them, it's hurting them, and they just don't see that. And it's also hurting the reputation of the great contractors in the industry as a whole. That I think again, this is a scenario where a rising tide lifts all boats, and we can't leave those
hmm
contractors behind. We got to help them understand how they need to be pricing their jobs, how they need to be organized. You can't, rob Peter to pay Paul. Like, that doesn't work. You need systems,
hmm
processes, you need financial literacy. And, my magic wand would help all those guys.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a common answer I get. And I guess that specifically when you're constantly undercutting your price, right? It's a race to the bottom, right? When you compete on price, you're just
Yep.
racing to the bottom, even if you get the job, right?
Yep.
Not a lot of profit there. So, understanding your value and competing on value and your pricing, accurately,
Yep.
definitely the way to go. All right. Well, Eric, this has been awesome. Really appreciate you taking the time, sharing so much experience and wisdom with us. For
Absolutely.
anyone who wants to learn more about you or JobTread or just follow along with the work you're doing, what's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just go to our website, jobtread.com. You can learn a whole lot of information from there. As I mentioned earlier, our YouTube is got hundreds and hundreds of videos there. But I'm pretty easy to connect with on on Facebook, LinkedIn. Happy to answer any questions I can. But yeah, just appreciate everyone. Love for the opportunity to show you what JobTread can do for your business. Right from our website, you can schedule a demo, and we'd love to take the time to walk you through it.
Awesome. Yeah, we will make sure to link that up in the description as well. Um, yeah, so thanks again for being here, Eric. Really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, definitely maybe hope to collaborate more with you down the road sometime.
Awesome. It's great to meet you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into Your Story, Your Impact, and we will see you next time.